truth was just beginning.
June 6, 1944. The gray waters of the English Channel churn beneath a cold, iron sky. Dawn bleeds slowly across the horizon, revealing an armada unlike anything seen before. Thousands of ships stretching as far as the eye can see, a floating city of steel and purpose. Engines rumble low, muffled by waves and wind. Inside the landing craft, young men grip their rifles tighter, sea spray mingling with fear on their faces. High above the beach, in concrete bunkers overlooking the Normandy coast, German soldiers watch through binoculars, stunned by the sight. Their officers, hardened veterans of Europe's brutal campaigns, exchange uneasy looks. Some laugh quietly. "Amateurs," one says. "Farmer soldiers from America. They will never make it past the tide." A radio crackles in the command post inland, where a field marshal studies the incoming reports. He smirks, lighting a cigarette, confident that the Atlantic Wall will hold. He had heard the rumors that the Americans were brave but undisciplined, strong but clumsy, fighting with machines rather than skill. But out at sea, the horizon keeps darkening with more ships. The laughter fades. The invasion has begun, and soon the myth of the farmer soldier will be buried in the sand of Omaha Beach. By 1944, Nazi Germany's war machine still ruled most of continental Europe. France had been under occupation for 4 long years. From the Atlantic coast to the eastern steppes, the Wehrmacht stood entrenched behind lines of concrete, wire, and gunfire. To the German High Command, these fortifications seemed unbreakable, especially the Atlantic Wall, Adolf Hitler's great barrier against invasion. It stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, bristling with bunkers, artillery, and machine gun nests aimed toward the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, had been tasked with its defense. After North Africa, he had learned to respect Allied air power and logistics, but even he underestimated the resolve behind the growing Allied armies across the Channel. German intelligence described the Americans as industrial warriors, soldiers born not of hardship, but of abundance, untested in the brutal realities of European war. Propaganda reinforced this illusion. Nazi broadcasts mocked the United States as a nation of mechanics and farmers, men who could build tractors but not storm a trench. "They fight with machines," one German paper wrote, "because they fear to fight as men." To many in the Wehrmacht, it was comforting to believe that these new opponents lacked the endurance and ruthlessness forged on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, Hitler's attention remained fixed on the Soviets. The Red Army's advance consumed Germany's resources and attention, while the West was seen as a secondary threat, a defensive theater held more by concrete than by conviction. The Führer himself believed any landing in France would be small, quickly crushed and repelled into the sea. In this mindset of arrogance and fatigue, Rommel tried to strengthen the coastal defenses. He ordered thousands of mines laid across the beaches and anti-landing obstacles planted in the surf. Entire villages were evacuated to make room for tank traps and firing positions. Yet he faced shortages of men, armor, and fuel. German troops stationed in Normandy were often static divisions, less mobile, less experienced, and in some cases composed of older or foreign soldiers. Still, confidence ran high. The Wehrmacht's record in Europe was unmatched, and Allied bombing campaigns had yet to cripple Germany's ability to fight. "No army can cross that sea," one officer said, "and if they do, they will die on the sand." But across the Channel a storm was building, not of weather, but of will, engineering, and sheer human determination. Every factory in America was now a weapon. Every dockyard, every train line, every assembly line poured its power into the coming blow. The men Germany mocked as farmers and mechanics were training with precision, equipped with technologies the world had never seen deployed on such a scale. They were not warriors by birth, but they were becoming something new, soldiers of an industrial empire, forged not by ideology but by purpose. And in England they waited, under gray skies and coated silence, for the order that would carry them into the fire. Their arrival would challenge not just German defenses, but German certainty itself. Across southern England, the roads groaned under the weight of history in the making. Every port, airfield, and meadow had become part of a vast organism, preparing for invasion. Operation Overlord, the plan to liberate Western Europe, had reached its final phase. More than 2 million Allied troops were now assembled in Britain, joined by over 150,000 vehicles and 7,000 ships. The logistics defied imagination. For months, entire towns had disappeared under camouflage nets, their streets filled with tanks and landing craft disguised from German reconnaissance. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower carried the weight of that moment with calm resolve. Around him, his planners, Montgomery, Ramsey, Bradley, and Lee Mallory, argued, calculated, and prepared. Their challenge was monumental: to land a force large enough to overwhelm the German Atlantic Wall, yet fast enough to survive the initial counterattack. The chosen target: Normandy, a quiet stretch of the French coast with strong defenses but within reach of Allied air cover. Secrecy was absolute. To deceive German intelligence, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, a grand illusion of fake armies, inflatable tanks, and phantom divisions aimed at convincing the Germans that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. Even Rommel's analysts accepted this falsehood, shifting critical reserves away from Normandy. Meanwhile, the men who would land first, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, were briefed in guarded halls. Maps showed 5 code-named beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Omaha, assigned to the Americans, was the most treacherous. A narrow strip between Vierville and Colville, its approaches covered by cliffs and heavy German guns. On the German side, preparations were incomplete. Rommel, though tireless, had long argued that the best chance to defeat the invasion was to strike the Allies as they landed, to throw them back into the sea before they could organize. But higher command disagreed. Hitler and his staff, clinging to rigid control, kept the Panzer divisions under direct reserve, to be released only on personal order from the Führer himself. When the moment came, that order would arrive far too late. As the days of early June passed, storms rolled across the Channel. The weather turned rough: wind, rain, and fog grounding aircraft and churning the sea. Many believed the invasion would be delayed again. Rommel, convinced no attack could come in such weather, left his command post to visit his wife in Germany, bringing a pair of shoes as a birthday gift. But far to the west, in Portsmouth, Eisenhower made his final decision. Reports from meteorologists offered a narrow window, a brief lull in the storm. It was risky, uncertain, but it was the only chance. "Okay," he said quietly. "We'll go." That night, while most of Europe slept, the greatest armada in history began to move. Ships slipped from ports in silence. Paratroopers loaded into aircraft bound for the darkness over France. On the Channel, men prayed, wrote letters, and stared into the mist, toward a shore none of them had yet seen. The German commanders, confident in their maps and illusions, did not yet understand that the tide had already turned. Within hours, the myth of invincibility would meet the courage of the untested, and the world would witness the breaking of the Atlantic Wall. From the air, the Atlantic Wall looked like a serpent of concrete and steel slithering along the French coastline. Its teeth were the bunkers, gun emplacements, and machine gun nests built to shred any landing attempt before it reached dry sand. Rommel's engineers had transformed beaches into killing zones. Wooden stakes topped with mines were driven into the shallows to tear open landing craft. Metal hedgehogs and steel obstacles filled the tidal flats to trap vehicles in the surf. Beyond them lay belts of barbed wire, trenches, and overlapping arcs of fire from MG-42s mounted in reinforced positions. The German 352nd Infantry Division held the Omaha sector, around 12,000 men, many veterans from the Eastern Front. They had the advantage of height and preparation. Observation posts carved into the cliffs gave them an unobstructed view of the beach below. Their artillery could rain shells on the incoming waves with mathematical precision. On paper, Omaha was a fortress. Rommel had insisted that every possible landing site be made a death trap, believing that if the Allies were stopped in the first hours, they would never return. The beaches were mined, the roads blocked, and the villages turned into strong points. Yet even this formidable defense had cracks, gaps in coordination, shortages in ammunition, and command lines that depended on orders from far above. The Atlantic Wall was built on the assumption that the enemy would break first. But on June 6th, it would meet an enemy that refused to. If Germany's strength lay in its fortifications, America's lay in its ingenuity. The D-Day invasion would not have been possible without an armory of inventions designed to solve problems no general had ever faced. The most iconic of them all was the Higgins boat, a flat-bottomed landing craft that could carry 30 soldiers, crash into a beach, drop its ramp, and release men directly into battle. Made of plywood and steel, it was simple, expendable, and mass-produced by the tens of thousands. The Germans had no equivalent. These boats, built in American shipyards and river docks, were the arteries of the invasion, carrying not just men, but the spirit of an industrial nation that could build faster than any enemy could destroy. Behind them sailed the vast naval force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers lined up in gunfire support positions. The USS Texas, the USS Arkansas, and the British HMS Belfast joined the bombardment, firing shells heavier than cars onto German positions. Above, waves of C-47 aircraft carried paratroopers into the night, while bombers targeted road networks to slow German reinforcements. Every movement, every shot, every mile had been calculated. The Allies were not improvising. They were executing a plan of mechanical precision, a symphony of logistics powered by factories an ocean away. The Germans saw men coming ashore. What they didn't see was the machine behind them, the assembly lines, the engineers, the women welding in American factories. The men landing at Omaha might have looked like farmers, but they were the spearhead of an industrial civilization designed for war. The Atlantic Wall had been built to stop soldiers. It was about to be tested against a nation's entire capacity to create. In the early hours before dawn, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions huddled inside their landing craft, soaked and silent. Many were young, 19, 20, barely old enough to shave. Some carried photographs of sweethearts tucked inside helmets. Others whispered small prayers into the roar of the engines. They were sons of farmers, factory workers, and school teachers, men who had never seen Europe until this moment. Their training had been relentless, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited. The sea heaved violently, tossing the boats like toys. Many were already seasick, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. In the dim light, the order came. 30 seconds. The ramps would drop, and the world would explode. What drove them forward was not hatred, nor even courage as they understood it, but duty, simple and unspoken. Each man knew the others depended on him. If one faltered, all could die. They had been told to expect resistance, but not annihilation. Yet as the craft approached the shallows and the sound of machine guns grew louder, something shifted. Fear turned to resolve. They had come too far to turn back. When the ramps fell, they ran into a storm of metal that would burn itself into history. For the German defenders of the 352nd Division, the first light of June 6th began like any other. A few soldiers on night watch noticed strange shadows on the horizon, too large to be fishing boats, too many to count. As the morning mist lifted, disbelief gave way to awe. The sea was filled with ships, thousands of them, stretching to the edge of the earth. Inside the bunkers overlooking Omaha, Lieutenant Fritz Ziegel and his comrades scrambled to their positions. They had fought the Soviets, endured the bombings. But this was something different. The radio channels were chaos. Some commanders refused to believe the invasion was real. Others shouted for artillery support that never came. When the bombardment began, the ground shook. Sand and rock rained from the ceilings. The men crouched behind their weapons, hearts pounding. Then silence, brief and deceptive. Out of the smoke came the landing craft, small gray rectangles crawling toward the beach. The gunners waited, letting them come close, and when the first ramps dropped, the beach turned red. MG-42s opened up at 1,200 rounds per minute, slicing through the surf. Mortars exploded among the waves, and screams echoed through the fog. From their vantage points, German machine gunners watched men fall and others keep coming, dragging the wounded using bodies for cover, advancing inch by inch. The defenders had seen bravery before, but not like this, not from men they had mocked as untrained and unworthy. The more they fired, the more the Americans came. As the battle for Omaha began, one man was missing from its defense: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The architect of the Atlantic Wall was hundreds of miles away, visiting his family in Germany. He had believed the weather would make any invasion impossible. His absence would prove costly. Without Rommel, German command at Normandy fractured. Field Marshals Rundstedt and Jodl hesitated to release the armored reserves without Hitler's explicit permission. That morning, the Führer was asleep at his headquarters in Bavaria. None dared wake him. Hours passed before orders reached the panzer divisions. By then, the beaches were already lost. Rommel's ideas to destroy the invasion at the waterline were sound, but they required decisive action in the first hours. Without him, confusion reigned. Officers on the ground fought bravely but without coordination. The 352nd Division, though well prepared, was left to face the entire might of the Allied invasion with little support or resupply. Rommel would later rush back to Normandy in fury and disbelief. What he found was chaos. The Atlantic Wall breached, his soldiers dead or captured, his predictions ignored. And as the tide receded that evening, the truth was unmistakable. The Americans had done what he thought impossible. Now the focus shifts to those critical hours. The moment the sea erupted in fire and Omaha Beach became the crucible of D-Day. The first wave struck Omaha at 6:30. The tide was still high, the air thick with smoke and mist. The German guns, hidden in concrete casemates, opened fire with surgical precision. Shells slammed into landing craft, flipping them over like toys. Men who leapt too early vanished beneath the waves, dragged down by packs weighing 80 pounds. When the ramps fell, the world erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the first rows instantly. The surf turned crimson. Platoons were cut down before a single man reached the shingle. On Easy Red, Dog Green, and Fox Green sectors, entire units disintegrated within minutes. Radios failed, officers were killed, and orders dissolved into chaos. The Americans found themselves pinned against the sea. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The rising tide crept closer, threatening to drown the wounded. Yet among the smoke and screams, small acts of courage began to emerge. Fragments of leadership that would hold the line. Captain Joe Dawson of the 1st Division rallied survivors behind a sand dune barely a foot high. Sergeant John Spaulding, armed with a carbine, led men up a draw under machine gun fire. Others, trapped in the water, feigned death until bursts paused long enough for them to crawl forward. Each yard was bought with blood. From the cliffs above, German gunners watched in disbelief. The Americans were supposed to retreat, to panic and break apart. Instead, they kept coming, crawling, wading, dragging wounded comrades through surf and shrapnel. The defenders adjusted their fire, expecting the next wave to collapse. It didn't. The naval bombardment that had failed to destroy the bunkers now returned in fury. Battleships closer to shore began firing at near point-blank range. The USS Texas unleashed its 14-inch guns so close that the shock waves rattled the cliffs. Entire fortifications vanished in seconds, burying defenders under tons of rock and sand. Still, it wasn't enough. The beach was a graveyard of metal and flesh. Smoke and debris blocked the horizon. The German 352nd held firm, believing the invasion could still be crushed. Then came the engineers, men carrying Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives. Crawling under fire, they shoved the charges into barbed wire and detonated paths for others to follow. By mid-morning, communications on the beach were nearly gone. The assault was fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance and survival. Commanders could not see or hear their men. Orders traveled by shouts and hand signals. Yet the chaos bred something new: initiative. Ordinary soldiers began taking command. Corporals became leaders, sergeants became captains, and the farmer soldiers the Germans had mocked turned into warriors by necessity. At 8 o'clock, the German field report still declared Omaha contained. Radio operators described the beaches as littered with bodies. Commanders congratulated one another, convinced the invasion would soon collapse. But beneath that illusion, the tide, both literal and human, was changing. Among the dunes, small groups of Americans had begun to climb the bluffs. By mid-morning, the tide had risen nearly to the seawall. The wounded who couldn't move were swallowed by the surf. German machine guns still swept the beach, but their barrels were overheating. Ammunition was running low. From inside the bunkers, soldiers watched with disbelief as the Americans, battered and broken, refused to disappear. At 9 o'clock, Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment landed on Easy Red. He saw the chaos firsthand, the wounded crying for medics, the living huddled behind wreckage. His words cut through the fear. There are two kinds of people on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Let's get the hell off this beach. That spark of defiance spread like wildfire. Small groups began scaling the bluffs, crawling through ditches and shell holes. Engineers blew gaps through barbed wire with what little explosives they had left. Riflemen followed, firing upward at muzzle flashes barely visible in the haze. By 10 o'clock they had reached the first German trenches. Combat turned to close quarters, grenades, bayonets, bare hands. The German defenders fought fiercely, but the balance was shifting. Their fields of fire had been perfect for the beach, not the cliffs. Once the Americans reached the top, the bunkers that had seemed impregnable became death traps. The naval guns added to the nightmare, pulverizing positions with terrifying accuracy. A shell from the USS Texas landed squarely on a machine gun nest that had pinned down hundreds. The shockwave tore the weapon apart and silenced its crew. American troops surged forward, clearing trench after trench. By 11:30, radio signals began to reach the ships offshore. Against all odds, footholds had been secured on multiple sectors. Reinforcements began to land under heavy fire. For the first time, the stars and stripes fluttered over the cliffs of Normandy. Inside the German command posts, confusion turned to panic. Reports from Omaha were contradictory. Some claimed victory, others begged for reinforcements. But the armored divisions still waited for permission from Hitler, who had not yet been woken. Rommel, hundreds of miles away, received the first fragments of disaster through garbled transmissions. "The Americans are breaking through," one message read. "We cannot hold them." The myth of the soft American soldier was dissolving in real time. These were no longer men of comfort or ease. They had become a relentless force, inventive, disciplined, and unyielding. By early afternoon, the beachhead at Omaha was secure. Smoke drifted inland as more troops poured ashore. The German positions that had laughed at the first wave were now silent ruins. On the cliffs above, amid the wreckage, a captured German officer looked out over the sea. What he saw was not chaos, but a machine. Hundreds of ships unloading with clockwork precision, columns of men and tanks advancing from the surf. "They bring the factories with them," he muttered, stunned. By evening, Omaha Beach belonged to the Allies. The cost was unimaginable, thousands dead or wounded, but the impossible had been done. And somewhere deep inside occupied France, the first whispers reached German high command. The Atlantic Wall had fallen. As the sun sank behind the smoke-filled horizon of Normandy, the scale of the battle began to emerge. Omaha Beach, that narrow strip of sand between Vierville and Colleville, was a wasteland of wreckage and sacrifice. Burned-out landing craft lay scattered like driftwood. The tide carried ash, blood, and broken rifles back to the sea. The smell of fuel and death hung heavy in the air. By nightfall, nearly 34,000 American soldiers had made it ashore. Around 2,400 were dead, wounded, or missing, one of the heaviest single-day tolls in American military history. But the bridgehead held. The German defenders, though fierce, had been overwhelmed by sheer persistence and naval firepower. Pockets of resistance still clung to the hills, but their lines were shattered. The first reports filtered back through Allied command. Eisenhower, in his headquarters in Portsmouth, read the updates in silence. The beaches were secured. The invasion had succeeded. The cost had been brutal, but it was the beginning of the end for Hitler's Fortress Europe. General Omar Bradley, who had watched the early landings through binoculars from his ship, admitted later that for hours he feared failure. "I thought we might be defeated there on the beach," he said, but the boys hung on. They fought their way up. They took it. Across the Channel, Churchill received the news with quiet relief. His dream of returning to the continent was now reality. Yet he also understood the weight of what had happened. Thousands of young men sacrificed in a single day for the chance to free Europe. This was the price of victory, he later wrote. For the Germans, the news was catastrophic. Radio Berlin initially downplayed the landings, describing them as limited raids. But by the next morning, even Hitler could no longer deny it. Reports from Normandy described entire sectors lost, communications cut, and morale collapsing. When Rommel returned to his headquarters and saw the situation for himself, his anger was volcanic. "The invasion has succeeded," he told his staff. "We have been defeated by our own arrogance." He had warned that the Atlantic Wall could never stop the Allies if they were allowed to establish a foothold. Now his fears were proven right. The Allies had not only landed, they had endured. In the days that followed, the German army scrambled to mount counterattacks. Panzer divisions rushed toward Normandy, but the Allied air forces ruled the skies. Columns of tanks were shredded by rocket-firing Typhoons and American Thunderbolts. Roads became graveyards of armor. For the soldiers who survived Omaha, there was little time to reflect. They dug in, built defenses, and pushed inland toward the hedgerows. Every field, every village became another fight. Yet something fundamental had changed. The men who had landed on that beach were no longer green. They had faced the worst the enemy could offer, and won. Back in Germany, among the officers who had once mocked the Americans as undisciplined farmer soldiers, silence replaced laughter. Reports described the sheer scale of the Allied assault, the endless ships, the coordination, the precision of logistics. For the first time, German generals began to understand what they were truly facing. Not just soldiers, but an industrial juggernaut, methodical and unrelenting. And as they regrouped, a grim realization settled over them. If this was the strength the Allies could bring in a single day, what could stop them now? In the days following the landings, Omaha Beach transformed from a battlefield into a living port. Bulldozers cleared wreckage while engineers laid steel mats over the sand, turning the once bloody shoreline into a highway of supply. Rows of landing craft arrived in precise rhythm, unloading trucks, artillery, and tanks. Field hospitals sprang up amid the dunes, and chaplains walked quietly between rows of makeshift graves. By June 10th, over 100,000 American troops had come ashore at Omaha alone. Fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements poured in. The logistical miracle that had carried them across the Atlantic now unfolded on the coast of France. Artificial harbors known as mulberries were constructed from massive prefabricated sections to shelter the constant flow of ships. Within days, the Allies had turned destruction into momentum. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft described what looked like a city forming on the beach, cranes, pipelines, and endless convoys moving inland. "They bring the factories with them," one captured officer repeated, stunned at what he saw. The myth of the farmer soldier was dead. These were not amateurs. They were the embodiment of a nation that had learned to turn its economic power into organized fury. Inside Hitler's headquarters, fury erupted. The Führer refused to believe the main invasion had struck Normandy, insisting it was a diversion for Pas-de-Calais. His hesitation cost critical hours. When the 12th SS Panzer Division finally moved toward the front, it was already too late. The Allies were dug in, with naval artillery and air supremacy guaranteeing their foothold. Rommel, inspecting the devastation, knew the truth. He stood on a cliff overlooking the beaches where his defenses had been torn apart. The Atlantic Wall, his great project, lay in ruins. The arrogance of underestimating the Americans had shattered with it. "They are not the soldiers we thought they were," he told his staff. "They fight with a determination that machines alone cannot explain." From that moment, German strategy in the West changed from prevention to survival. The Wehrmacht would fight bitterly for every hedge, every road, but the initiative was gone. The Allies had breached Fortress Europe, and with every passing day their armies grew stronger. The beaches of Normandy became the foundation of liberation. For the Americans who survived Omaha, the memories would never fade. Many described the beach not as victory, but as endurance. A place where courage was simply doing the next thing despite terror. They had come as boys, mocked by their enemies as untested and soft, and left as men who had proved the power of resolve over reputation. The laughter that had once echoed in German command posts was replaced by silence and disbelief. The world had changed in a single day. The Germans had looked upon the Americans as naive laborers, sons of farmers, mechanics, and clerks, and learned that industry, when joined with will, could become unstoppable. From the wreckage of Omaha rose a new image of the American soldier, not the farmer mocked by propaganda, but the builder of victory. And as night fell on that scarred coast, the tide washed over the broken steel and the silent dead, erasing footprints but not memory. The war in Europe had turned, and history would never forget where it began. In the quiet after the storm, Omaha Beach no longer looked like a battlefield. The air that had once echoed with machine gun fire and cries for medics now held only the sound of the sea. Waves rolled gently against rusted obstacles, and gulls circled above the remnants of landing craft half buried in the sand. The tide had returned to its eternal rhythm, as if the earth itself sought to heal what men had torn apart. In the years that followed, grass grew over the cliffs and the bunkers filled with shadows. The scars faded, but the memory did not. Each summer, pilgrims came, soldiers who had survived, and children who had not yet been born when the sea ran red. They stood among the white crosses and read the names of the fallen, row upon endless row, realizing that victory had not come cheaply. The words of that captured Japanese captain, spoken years before in another war, seemed to echo across time. They bring the factories with them. It was not merely factories that had crossed the ocean, but a spirit, a nation's collective belief that freedom was worth building, worth fighting for, and worth dying for. For the German officers who once laughed at the amateur army, history offered its verdict. The Americans had not conquered through numbers alone, nor through wealth or machinery. They conquered through unity, through the ordinary men who became extraordinary when duty called. Every Higgins boat that hit the sand carried not just soldiers, but the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Farmers, machinists, clerks, teachers, each one part of a vast living machine driven by something greater than command, the conviction that tyranny must not stand. And when the last guns fell silent and the last wave receded, the truth of Omaha remained. It was not a triumph of technology, nor a tale of invincibility. It was the story of courage, raw, imperfect, human courage, meeting the test of history. Today, when the sea mist drifts across Normandy, one can almost hear it. The faint hum of engines, the whispered prayers of men in the dark, and the unspoken promise they carried across the channel. They had come to a foreign shore as strangers. They left it consecrated ground, Omaha Beach, where America brought its factories, its faith, and its sons, and changed the course of the world forever.